ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's semi-final debate. My name is Alia and I'm the chairman of this debate. The timekeeper is Esther. This debate will be judged by a panel of 3 adjudicators, who are Mr. Matt Hume, Ms. France, and Ms. Sonia Lowen. The topic of this debate is that we should change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Immanuel College. The negative team seated to my left is from Adelaide High. The speaking time for this debate is 8 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. Please ensure that your mobile phones are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Jaden Green.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that we should change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Reconciliation, in whatever form and to whatever extent it will manifest itself in, is one of the great challenges Australia must overcome in the foreseeable future. Since the beginning of modern Australia in 1788, with the arrival of the First Fleet, there has been an imbalance between the new settled colony of Australia and Indigenous Australians which lived on this land for tens of thousands of years. Division between these two completely foreign worlds has continued as Australian society has evolved, sometimes with devastating consequences, as we see in policies such as the stolen generation and statistical differences in life expectancy, incarceration and economic participation, which remain significant to this very day. Before I move to define the topic itself, I would like to set a foundation for this debate, which I hope the negative team will agree on. That as a society, Australia does and should aspire towards reconciliation between Indigenous people and the Australian state. Therefore, this debate is about how we should best go about doing this. And as the affirmative team, we will make a case as to why the voice would make a strong contribution to reconciliation. But equally, we acknowledge that it is certainly not the only policy that could bring Australia further on that road, and should certainly be assessed on its merits. Now, a definition for the topic, that we should change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We would like to inform the definition of voice by the co-design process undertaken and completed in 2021. This is a model that maintains the sovereignty of Parliament as the sole lawmaker in the Commonwealth and consists of approximately 35 representatives from various Indigenous communities which are given the duty to inform Parliament on issues relating to Indigenous Australians. We also note that the model relies on a voice system that stretches down to state and local governments to ensure a whole-of-government system for representing Indigenous Australians. Of course, this model has not been fully decided yet, so we'll make our points generally, but for the sake of constructive debate, this substantial policy should form the basis of our understanding of the voice. Secondly, we take change the Australian Constitution to mean conduct a referendum with the intention of enshrining this advisory body within the Australian Constitution, giving it a level of permanence as an Australian institution. Further, we would assert that constitutionally including a voice to Parliament must be complemented by a constitutional recognition of the pre-existing Indigenous population that existed before the founding of the British Australian colony. Now a team split. As first speaker, I will begin by giving the legal background to the founding of the modern Australian state, explaining how it is the only country in the world that does not technically adhere to the principles of territory acquisition in both the 1700s and today. I will then explain how, in the aspiration towards reconciliation and the necessity to make technical amends, the voice to Parliament is a reasonable balance between the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous Australians and the modern British Australia. Our second speaker will explain how policy failures in relation to Indigenous Australians have been the result of a lack of consultation, giving concrete examples of ineffective policies such as the Closing the Gap policy, and explaining how the voice to Parliament would change the outcome of similar policies. He will then explain how, if we as Australia want meaningful consultation, we must recognise that the special relationship between Indigenous people and the Australian land. Finally, he will explain how the voice is a way to ensure that each level of government has a high-quality Indigenous constitutional framework. Now to my first substantive point, that the Australian state is not founded on any ground recognised in international law, in 1788 that is, or in the present, and that the voice, with its necessary implications on Australia's constitution, would resolve this unique legal discrepancy in Australia's statehood. At the time that Australia was founded, there were 3 means of acquiring land recognised by the international community. later codified into international law. These were treaty, exercise of authority, and conquest. Australia was founded under the principle of exercise of authority, which includes the discovery and occupation of uninhabited lands, hence the use of the terra nullius principle in founding Australia. At the time of Australia's proclamation, the validity of the application of terra nullius was not questioned. In a legal sense, the international community was satisfied by the British assessment that the native inhabitants of Australia were not people to a sufficient standard, requiring negotiation or a formal declaration of war. The other two options, treaty and conquest, were specifically excluded from justifying the British claim from Australia through a number of acts of British Parliament in the 1800s. But for the sake of completeness, a nation founded on treaty, like the United States, requires a formal agreement between the traditional occupiers of the land and a new group of settlers. Conquest, on the other hand, like British Iraq, is a formal declaration and victory in war against existing occupants. The colony of Australia did not officially go to war against the Indigenous people, nor was there any treaty or agreement, and scholarly debates have generally come to a consensus after a few decades of debate that it would be incorrect to retrospectively assert that Australia was founded by conquest. Australia is the only country in this predicament where, if we technically apply the principles of international law of 1788 and today, we find that Australia should not be recognised as a state. The only reason it was is because we accepted that Indigenous people were not people. We believe it is wrong to continue on this assumption, and given this exceptional circumstance, Australia needs a uniquely significant solution: the Indigenous Voice to Parliament. When the Mabo decision was handed down in 1992, it was particularly significant because it recognised the discrepancy in modern Australia's origin, that Australia was not founded on the principle of terra nullius, but the courts are in no capacity to question the act of the state, the technical term for the claim of initial sovereignty. Therefore, it comes down to a constitutional change, such as to include a voice to Parliament to remove the discrepancies in Australia's founding and form an effective foundation of governance into Australia's future. This is not just to the benefit of Indigenous Australians, this is to the legal benefit and legitimacy of the Australian state. As I've already explained, Australia is an exceptional case in that it was not founded with the recognition of existing occupants, nor was it truly settled on occupied land. But in order to move towards reconciliation, this is exactly what must be done. While it is unreasonable to claim Australia is an illegitimate country going against international law in its occupation, it is also unreasonable for us to accept Australia how it is today. Imagine if we were to make a change to the Constitution, declaring land today, declaring that Australia was founded on uninhabited land today, aligning with the principle of terra nullius. It would just be completely wrong. Therefore, in order to strike a balance between this view of pre-colonisation Australia and modern-day Australia, we need to accommodate in some way to Indigenous perspectives within Australia's current framework and practices. As created and supported by Indigenous groups in Australia, and more recently by Australia's government, an Indigenous Voice to Parliament is a way of doing just this. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, Australia is an exceptional circumstance. We have established that Australia needs a unique and effective solution in our aspiration towards reconciliation. To achieve this, we must strike a balance between modern-day Australia and the traditional inhabitants of this land and their perspectives. The Voice to Parliament, as it has currently been put, will increase the quality of Indigenous consultation across all levels of government in a way that is respectful to the institutions which modern Australia is built on. Reconciliation is never perfect, but the Voice to Parliament is among the most effective pathways towards reconciliation that Australia has before it. Thank you.
Call upon the first negative speaker, Ruth Walker.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that we should change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We, the negative team, unequivocally disagree with this statement. We agree with the definition given by the affirmative team. but would like to say that we agree with reconciliation, but believe it would be best be through a treaty or legislation. Furthermore, we reinforce that the proposed model is not the definite model, as Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, said himself that getting into every detail is not a recipe for success. I will begin by refuting the opposition's claims. The first affirmative speaker tried to tell you that reconciliation has a legal benefit. In the words of Indigenous woman Lydia Thorpe, who will be referenced by our second speaker, we don't need a referendum to have a treaty in this country, and the treaty is what our people have been fighting for decades and decades. A treaty is far more appropriate in achieving reconciliation, as it has been requested by Indigenous people for so long, and has been set by the trailblazer countries such as New Zealand. Tonight, as the first speaker, I will be talking to you about how the process of altering the Constitution through a referendum is long, expensive, and frequently unsuccessful in Australia. I will then discuss how it is unnecessary to have a constitutional voice to Parliament and that it should instead be statutory. Our second speaker will talk to you about how vague the proposed referendum is. She will also discuss how it is illogical to have a constitutional voice without first acknowledging Aboriginal people as Indigenous to Australia and their connection with the land in the Constitution itself. She will finally speak about how the proposal does not address everyday problems, as stated by Indigenous MPs. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. My first point is that it is undeniably difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to change the Constitution, and in Australia it is infamously unsuccessful. The process of changing the Constitution is long and demanding because the only way to alter the Constitution is through a compulsory referendum. According to the Australian Parliamentary Office, in this process, a bill must first be drafted by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, and after the Office of Parliamentary Counsel follows the painstaking bill-making process, it must then follow the first, second, and third readings in Parliament, as well as allowing for the committee stage. On top of this, the bill must undergo bicameral scrutiny, and after that, it can finally be put to the people as a referendum to accept or reject the alteration. Furthermore, referendums entail long campaigns from both sides, as well as educating the public about the contents of the proposed change. According to the Australian Electoral Commission, the 1999 referendum cost more than 66 million Australian dollars. To put this in perspective, today that would be worth 115 million Australian dollars. This is outrageously expensive, especially if the result is a no. In addition, Warren Mundine, the former chairman of the Indigenous Advisory Council, questioned the expense, saying, "Why does the voice to Parliament have to go in the Constitution at an enormous cost of some 180 to 200 million dollars, not including the money spent already? How about Parliament legislate the voice and do something better with that money by spending it on the ground in ways that could produce practical results right now?" Furthermore, for a referendum to be successful, a double majority vote must be achieved. This is a yes from the majority of voters in a majority of states, meaning at least 4 out of the 6, and a national majority of voters, meaning an overall yes vote from more than 50% of the population. This takes enormous amounts of time for everyone to vote, then collect all the votes, and then count them up to arrive at a final result. Furthermore, according to the Australian Electoral Commission, since 1901 there have been 44 referendums held, and only 8 of these have been successful. Therefore, a referendum is an extremely expensive and long process, and considering that historically when referendums have been put to the Australian people, they have mostly been denied, and it is not warranted in this circumstance. My second point is that it is unnecessary to have a constituted voice to Parliament and should instead be statutory. Why should we put such an important issue at such high risk of being overturned or delayed? A statutory change can occur once there is a simple majority vote in Parliament, which won't require the referendum process, thereby saving time, effort, and money. Implementing this voice in statutory law is more suitable under the aforementioned circumstances, With this in mind, the Uluru Statement from the Heart gives 3 main recommendations to repair the wrongdoing of the past and unite all Australians in the future: voice, treaty, and truth. If we spend all our time, money, and effort on enshrining a voice to Parliament in the Constitution, when it would be just as effective if it was statutory, how will we possibly implement a truth-telling commission as well as sign a symbolic treaty? Moreover, the Constitution is much more difficult to change than statutes, because a constitutional change has a longer-term effect. While this may be perceived as a positive, this means that a constitutional change is not responsive to immediate needs or events. Furthermore, it's important to acknowledge that the only jurisdiction that can interpret the Constitution is the High Court of Australia, meaning unelected officials with no affinity to the voice of Parliament will undeservedly determine its fate. Additionally, as the Constitution is so difficult to change and add to, it is also difficult to remove a law from, which is no longer suitable, relevant, or was created by people in positions of power who were corrupt. For example, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commissions, also known as ATSIC, was formed in March 1990 and was later dissolved in June 2005, according to the Reconciliation Essay. ATSIC aimed to formally involve Indigenous peoples in the process of government which would affect their lives. This commission was not enshrined in the Constitution, and this later proved incredibly important when it became apparent that the chairperson of the commission, Jeff Clark, was accused of 380 charges of corruption and manipulation for personal gain, stretching 3 decades, and the misappropriation of $2 million, according to the ABC. Luckily, this commission was able to be abolished, as it never made it to the constitutional level. This shows the importance of statute law over constitutional. If this commission had been admitted to the Constitution, Australians would have to continue dealing with a discredited commission, possibly still to this day. Even if corruption does not occur, with society ever changing, having the ability to change statute law is an enormous benefit. Therefore, a statutory change has more benefits than a constitutional change, as it is more efficient and saves time, money, and effort. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we should not change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Altering the Constitution through a referendum is an expensive, time-consuming, and infamously unsuccessful process in Australia. We propose that it is unnecessary to have a constituted voice to Parliament due to the overwhelming difficulty to change the Constitution and should instead be statutory. Thank you.
Call upon the second affirmative speaker, Noah Keating.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that we should change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We, as the Affirmative team, most definitely believe this to be true. I'd like to start by addressing some flaws in the first negative speaker's speech. The first negative speaker has tried to convince you that the process of altering the Constitution through a referendum is long, expensive, and often unsuccessful in Australia, and therefore it is not worth it to hold a referendum to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Now, we as the Affirmative team strongly disagree with this, since this topic is one related to reconciliation and is deeply important to many Indigenous Australians, of whom have suffered many severe consequences since the arrival of colonisers in Australia, and hence the time, effort and cost to take this first step in bringing reconciliation between Australian state and Indigenous people is worth the time, effort and effort to put into place. They've also tried to tell you that the treaty is the desired outcome for reconciliation. However, what would you have in a treaty? A treaty needs to have something in it. And could one of these things not be an Indigenous voice to Parliament? Something highly effective, as I'll soon elaborate upon during my speech. To recap, our first speaker gave a legal background to the founding of the modern Australian state, explaining how it is the only country in the world that does not technically adhere to the legal principles of territory acquisition, further explaining how the voice to Parliament strives towards an effective balance in the aspiration towards reconciliation. Now to my 4 primary arguments. Firstly, past policy failures in relation to Indigenous Australians have been the result of a lack of consultation. Closing the Gap is a national strategy launched in 2008 with the aim of reducing inequality between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other Australians in areas such as health, education and unemployment. While a great idea and definitely a vital step forwards for Australia, the success of this strategy has been greatly underwhelming. The Australian Government Productivity Commission Closing the Gap Annual Data Compilation Report, July 2022, shows that only 4 of the 17 targets are on track to be met within the next decade. Despite good intentions held by the government, there has been a lack of effective communication between those making policies regarding Indigenous Australians and the communities themselves. Senior researcher at the Southgate Institute for Health, Society and Equity at Flinders University, Dr. Matthew Fisher, effectively sums up the issue with the Closing the Gap strategy. Despite talk of governments doing things with and not to Indigenous Australians, we found that most strategies implemented under Closing the Gap are controlled from the top by government agencies, leaving little room for Indigenous communities to have a say. With the implementation of an Indigenous voice to government, the government would no longer be doing things to Indigenous Australians, but with them. The introduction of a fully fledged co-design system would enable the input of Indigenous Australian citizens being affected by the Closing the Gap policies, allowing for more effective decision making and an increase in success for the strategy as a whole. It is vital that if the government is to avoid the failures of previous policies aimed at assisting Indigenous Australians, that they must work with them and not for them, and this is what the Indigenous Voice to Parliament is aimed at achieving. Moving on to my second point, that if you want meaningful consultation, you must recognise the special relationship between Indigenous people and Australia. The relationship shared between Indigenous Australians and the land on which they live is a unique connection which must be acknowledged by the Australian state in order for mutually beneficial consultation and decisions to occur. Indigenous Australians have the right to maintain elements of their traditional way of life and culture, so long as it does not impede on others. An Indigenous voice to Parliament allows Indigenous Australians to maintain elements of their way of life and culture by establishing a connection to various levels of governments and letting Indigenous Australians consult lawmakers with the aim of expressing Indigenous perspectives on various issues. Since the advent of modern Australia, a majority of major decisions have been made with blatant disregard for Indigenous Australian culture, despite many of these decisions directly impacting Indigenous way of life. For example, countless mining sites have been erected on Aboriginal land, resulting in the destruction of wildlife and ancestral sites deeply rooted within Indigenous culture. With the implementation of an Indigenous voice, all levels of government and decision-making will benefit from increased communication with Indigenous peoples, allowing for a wider range of perspectives and cultures to have an impact on the decisions made in our country. My third point is that the community-led nature of the local and regional voice section of an Indigenous Voice to Parliament will greatly improve upon the current methods of consultation with Indigenous peoples. Another quote from Dr. Matthew Fisher states, Indigenous leaders said consistently that Closing the Gap policy will be more successful when it supports greater community control at a local level and puts more focus on strategies to build community resources for health and well-being. In the current plan for an Indigenous Voice to Parliament, the local and regional voice would be comprised of a regional level governance structure that will, quote, be designed and led by communities and provide advice to all levels of government about what's important in communities and in the region. By implementing a governance and consultation structure at a local level that will be designed and run by Indigenous communities themselves, unlike current and previous systems, the community-led design of a local voice allows for communities to decide and act upon the most effective method of having their voices and opinions heard. Now to close out my argument with the fact that the voice is a way to ensure that each level of government has a high-quality Indigenous consultation framework. By creating a unified framework for Indigenous consultation across federal, state, and local government, it will help replace the patchwork of consulting and co-design initiatives that are currently in place, streamlining the consultation process and increasing the likelihood of positive change coming from the process. The current plan for an Indigenous voice to Parliament consists of two parts: local and regional voices and a national voice. As explained in my third point, the local and regional voice would be a regional level governance structure providing advice to all levels of government about what's important to communities in the region. The national voice would be a national body of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that would provide advice to the Australian government and engage with the government early on in the development of relevant policies and laws. A key part of this system is the two-way advice link between local and regional and national voices, allowing for communication between different levels of decision-making under the one system. The current patchwork of systems leads to difficulty in communication between communities, resulting in a decrease of effectiveness and increase in time required to achieve anything. However, a single unified voice would allow for much greater efficiency in communication and would greatly increase the likelihood of individual ideas and opinions being spread further than simply the local community. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we, the Affirmative team, are in firm belief that we should most definitely change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Previous policies aimed at supporting Indigenous Australians, such as those involved in Closing the Gap strategy, have often failed due to a lack of effective consultation with Indigenous communities. Additionally, it is vital that Indigenous perspectives and cultures are represented in the decisions made by governments, something that can only occur with established connections between Indigenous peoples and those in charge of the country. Finally, the current plan for an Indigenous voice to Parliament provides a unified method of connecting various levels of government to Indigenous communities, along with community-led regional governance structures, allowing for greatly increased effectiveness in communication compared to the current patchwork of systems in place. It is clear that if Australia is to strive towards reconciliation, that our governments must start by making decisions with Indigenous people, not for them. An Indigenous voice is one large step towards achieving this goal. Thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Angelina Lugsden.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that we should change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We, the negative team, emphatically disagree with this statement. I will begin by rebutting the arguments that have been made by the Affirmative team. The first speaker has tried to tell you that constituting a voice to Parliament will inspire reconciliation between Indigenous Australians and the rest of the public. However, this does not mean that a voice to Parliament must be constitutional. In a statutory voice to Parliament, as our first speaker has stated, First Nations issues can be debated all the same, without a lengthy, time-consuming, inefficient and expensive referendum process. Additionally, a voice to Parliament is not the only way to inspire reconciliation between all Australian peoples. As our first speaker has stated, and I will address, the Uluru Statement from the Heart additionally requests for a treaty. The second speaker has tried to tell you that we should pay the enormous price of a referendum that could still fail for reconciliation. However, again, we can achieve reconciliation through a voice to Parliament, through legislation, not a constitutional change. Furthermore, he said that a treaty, like that of New Zealand or Canada, could entail a voice to Parliament, and this is completely true. However, this does not mean that this voice to Parliament must be written into our sacred constitution. Legislation would still achieve the same circumstances. The second speaker has additionally spoken about how we should address the special connection that Indigenous Australians have with the land. And again, we completely agree with this. In fact, we believe that a more effective way of achieving reconciliation is to acknowledge this in the Constitution, instead of constituting a voice to Parliament, which can be legislated instead. I will later address this in my second point. Our first speaker has spoken to you about the overwhelming difficulty to change the Constitution due to the expensive, time-consuming and notoriously unsuccessful referendum process. She also spoke to you about how it is unnecessary to have a constituted voice of Parliament, as no other committees are enshrined in the Constitution, and that it holds little to no benefit above a statutory voice. I will speak to you about the ambiguity surrounding the proposed referendum and also about how a constituted voice of Parliament is pointless until we acknowledge Indigenous Australians in the Constitution first. I will also speak about how prominent Indigenous Australians have denounced a constitutional voice to Parliament as it is pointless to pursue until the treaty has been signed. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. My first point is that the current referendum process is enshrined in ambiguity and confusion. As our first speaker has already mentioned, referenda are time-consuming, expensive, and notoriously unsuccessful. Nonetheless, previous referenda failures have occurred democratically and truthfully, whereby the sitting government has provided the exact details for the proposed alteration of the Constitution. However, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has repeatedly refused to provide an adequate level of detail on the proposed voice to Parliament, going even further to state that he wouldn't go down the cul-de-sac of getting into every detail because that is not a recipe for success. Furthermore, there's clear confusion even amongst sitting government about the details of the voice. In an interview with Q&A, Linda Burney, the current Minister for Indigenous Affairs, stated that it would be nuts for a referendum to occur without further details being provided. She additionally went as far to state that there will be a lot of information out in the community about what people are voting on, and even suggested that members of the Voice of Parliament would be elected. With this confusion even amongst the government in mind, how could we possibly put the Voice of Parliament in the Constitution? This confusion highlights questions that have simply been left unanswered despite the proposal to change Australia's founding document. For example, who will be eligible to sit on the Voice of Parliament? If so, will they be elected? How long will their terms be for? All of these questions have simply been left ignored, which is a spit in the face to the real issues that Indigenous Australians face on a day-to-day basis. This issue of ambiguity is exactly why we should have a Voice to Parliament enshrined in legislation instead, as our first speaker has already mentioned. Due to the unsuccessful nature of referenda in Australia, it will be almost impossible to resolve the details and issues within the voice, as real change cannot be made without going through expensive, time-consuming and unsuccessful referendum process, which further enforces why we should not enshrine a voice to Parliament in our Constitution. My second point is that enshrining a voice to Parliament in the Constitution without recognising the unique connection that First Nations people have with the land, as well as acknowledging them as Indigenous to Australia first, is simply pointless. There is simply no reason to constitute a voice to Parliament before we even acknowledge Aboriginals as Indigenous to Australia. Before the 1967 referendum, First Nations peoples were only mentioned twice, in Sections 51, Part 26 and Section 127. Due to the discriminatory nature, these clauses were rightfully removed in the most successful referendum in Australian history, meaning that currently, Aboriginals are not acknowledged in the Constitution. I would like to remind the audience that no other committee is enshrined in our Constitution. Without first acknowledging why Indigenous Australians are special to this land in the Constitution, we simply cannot justify having a special committee that cannot be dissolved without a referendum. Just like how we do not recognise Christmas without acknowledging it as a public holiday, how can we possibly justify making this committee special by enshrining it in our integral Constitution without recognising the unique status of Indigenous Australians? My third point is that notable Indigenous Australians have actively voiced their disagreement with the proposed voice, as First Nations peoples believe that a treaty signed by the Australian Government and Indigenous Australians bears more significance than constituting a voice to Parliament. As stated by Lydia Thorpe, an Indigenous Member of Parliament, and corroborated by Caleb Mabo, the grandson of the great Eddie Mabo, we need to talk about a treaty first because we haven't settled the conflict that's been happening for over 200 years. The notability of these two Indigenous Australians proves the importance of treaty signing in comparison to the long process of constituting a voice to Parliament, considering the fact that we can quickly and efficiently make a legislative voice to Parliament anyway. Additionally, First Nations MP Karen Little has stated that rushing a voice to Parliament by enshrining it in the Constitution could distract from issues that have been highlighted by the integral Closing the Gap framework, as the Affirmative team has already mentioned. This could mean that real, everyday issues that Indigenous Australians face could be neglected just because we unnecessarily take the long, expensive process of enshrining the voice in the Constitution. Furthermore, as according to the BBC, Australia remains the only Commonwealth nation to have never signed a treaty with its Indigenous people. As I've already stated, New Zealand and Canada have already signed a treaty with their Indigenous people, and Canada has even enshrined it in their constitution. As our first speaker has already stated, referendums are expensive, unsuccessful, and time-consuming, meaning that less effort can be expended on another element of the statement from the heart, treaty making. Why should we bother constituting a voice to Parliament if prioritising a treaty would not only be more meaningful and beneficial to Indigenous Australians, but would also give Australia more credibility on the world stage and with our other Commonwealth nations? In conclusion, we should not change the Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament because there is an extreme amount of ambiguity surrounding the proposed voice. and because Indigenous Australians are not yet mentioned in the Constitution. Furthermore, notable Indigenous Australians have voiced their disagreement with the proposed constitutional voice of Parliament, reinforcing why we should not incorporate this voice into our Constitution. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Elia Adelaide.
Sorry. Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. In Australia's aspiration towards reconciliation, obviously solutions will be debated. That's what we're doing here tonight. As the Affirmative team, we have proposed that Australia should change its constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament as an effective solution in our aspiration towards reconciliation. Now to address the negative team's case. I'd like to start by making a small note about the definition and what exactly the voice to Parliament is, as our two teams interpreted it. We acknowledge that obviously nothing has been decided on, and we have made the majority of our points in a general principle. However, we would like to say in a topic that is so broad, it is reasonable to rely on the co-design process that has been put forward as the primary thing that we should be considering. We would also like to note that the negative team critiques the ambiguity of this specific proposal, yet asserts that we should not consider any one particular solution. Therefore, we think it is reasonable in rebutting the overall team case to consider this co-design process as the main model to consider. One of the things that the negative team said is that a voice to Parliament would not recognise the Indigenous people's connection with the land by default. We simply refute this. In every single proposition about a potential voice to Parliament, recognition of the peoples must be done with that. Every potential needs to recognise it before a voice is established. It simply can't happen without it, and we do not see a reasonable interpretation of this topic to be one without the other. Now, the negative team went on to discuss how there isn't enough adequate detail in the Constitution, comparing this also with a potential statutory approach. I note that the Constitution is never specifically detailed. It is about setting an overarching framework. As the negative team said, it is a sacred document. It sets the foundation of our country. It doesn't necessarily provide specific things in our country. For example, the fact that all Australians have to vote, compulsory voting. That's not written in the Constitution. Yet we take that as a sacred part of our democracy. This setting of a foundation is what the voice to Parliament in the Australian Constitution is about. It's about setting a foundation that Indigenous Australians will have an institution to go to advise Parliament with, and advise all levels of government with. We'd also like to make the point that the constitutional voice to Parliament is certainly not exclusive to a further statutory approach to this voice. In fact, most things in the Constitution are supported with further statutory laws which specify exactly how these should function. As I gave the example of before, compulsory voting in Australia, the Australian Constitution specifies that Australians have the right to vote. It specifies nothing else. Therefore, that's when a further system of legislation needs to come in to support this, and we would absolutely agree with the negative team that we need this later development and more specific detail in laws which can be amended. But this is not as effective simply on its own, because a constitutional voice to Parliament provides this foundation that Indigenous Australians now and forever will be recognised in our Constitution as the traditional owners of this land. They also make a point as to how having a constitutional amendment is supposedly rushing it, And they point to a number of examples of MPs commenting on the fact that if we have a constitutional amendment, constitutional recognition, this does not go through the same due process as statutory law. We simply disagree with this. In fact, we point to their very own arguments that the constitutional amendment process is long and lengthy. There is debate, lots of debate, years of it, as the negative team has thankfully pointed out. A constitutional amendment is the last thing other than rushing. It is the proper due process that Australia needs to recognise a very valuable issue in the society, and we believe that we should not be rushing it. We agree with the negative team on that. But we think a statutory approach would be rushing that and cutting corners. A constitutional amendment requires Australia to have a think, to look back and really think about whether this is something that we need. They also discussed a comparison between a voice to Parliament and a treaty. Now, for a start, we don't think these are necessarily exclusive, and we look to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which recommends in that document that voice comes first. Why we say this? A treaty isn't recognition. A treaty is, in some ways, the deal that happens out of recognition. As our first speaker pointed out, the three means of territorial acquisition back in the 1700s, treaty, exercise of authority, and conquest. You need to recognise that the people existed on the land before you can have a treaty. Again, we agree with the negative team that we should do this. But having a voice to Parliament is beneficial to informing the treaty that we have. The treaty needs something in it. It could sort of double back on itself and say it reaffirms a voice to Parliament or have some other mechanisms or some other recognition of Indigenous Australians. But foundationally, a voice to Parliament is necessary to effectively inform a treaty. If you do not have the forum in a parliamentary and institutional sense to discuss why we need a treaty or what that treaty should contain, that treaty will by nature be ineffective. They also commented on the fact how that it is beneficial, or rather harmful to constitutional or elements in the Constitution because only High Court justices can interpret them. Well, as the affirmative team, we say thank goodness. Obviously, elected officials have an important role in writing legislations, but I would correct the negative team to some extent to say that politicians never interpret the laws they write. That's always the judge's job. The only difference is that for statutory approach, as the negative team suggests, politicians could come back and change those laws at any one time. Say next year we have a change of government, and that government believes that an Indigenous voice to Parliament is wrong. Well, that voice could be gone. It's as easy as that. It's rushing it. It's not having a proper debate. It's not considering what are the implications of this. A voice to Parliament, recognised in the Constitution, means that Australia has to have a period of serious and reasonable debate. We think that is only a good thing. Furthermore, all legislation not in the Constitution can be interpreted by lower courts. And we would say the fact that the Constitution is reserved for the High Court is only a good thing. The best and most recognised judges in the land being able to interpret, as the negative team say, a sacred document. We think the sacredity of the Indigenous voice to Parliament is important. We think it's not just about recognising a voice in a technical sense. We think, as our first speaker pointed out, that this is about Australia's fundamental founding and how we recognise the traditional owners of this land. This is not necessarily about, this is not exclusive to creating effective systems. We can have legislation that comes next, but what we need is a fundamental, well thought out, permanent change to our Constitution to recognise Indigenous peoples. To recap my team case. Our first speaker set a foundation that Australia was founded on exceptional legal circumstances, and how, on a technicality, it doesn't actually fit in with the legal frameworks of the 1700s, nor today. He went on to discuss how the voice to Parliament is an effective balance between the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous Australians and the modern Australian state. Our second speaker discussed how many of the failures of policy regarding Indigenous Australians have been through a lack of consultation, moving on to explain how exactly the voice to Parliament is an effective solution to those shortcomings. Ladies and gentlemen, Australia needs fundamental change, and we are an exceptional circumstance. We are the only country that doesn't fit in to the neat little boundaries drawn by international law. We need something permanent. We need something that requires the country to debate. We recognise that constitutional amendments are difficult, and we think that is good. Ladies and gentlemen, we need debate. It takes time, but we think that is something good. Thank you.
call upon the third negative speaker, Kate Dispersal.
Good evening, Madam Chairperson and members of the audience. The topic for tonight's debate is that we should change the Australian Constitution to enable an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We, the negative team, believe that this statement is irrefutably false. As the third speaker, I will begin by refuting the claims of the opposition before summarising our team case. The first speaker has tried to tell you that as Australia's circumstances are unique, we must have a unique solution to reconciliation. However, enshrining a voice to Parliament is not the unique solution to reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. As our team has reiterated throughout our team case, constituting a voice to Parliament gives no benefit above having a voice to Parliament in legislation. Furthermore, the unique way of reconciling will have an unwanted effect. Instead of elected parliamentarians debating issues, only High Court judges may determine the unique voice to Parliament's fate. Their second affirmative speaker also claimed that it is an important change so the resources are worth it. However, although we agree that it is an important change, we do believe that these resources could be better used in better ways, such as maximising these resources in a way that directly benefits our Indigenous community. Like our first speaker said, it is a slow, expensive process, which is a waste of resources when we could just use those resources to put it back into the local community, which would do more than changing the constitution. They also claimed that it would reduce inequality by allowing Indigenous peoples to have their issues consulted by other Indigenous peoples, and it would spread further than just the local communities. However, our first speaker has already discussed how this could be done in a far more efficient and safe manner through legislation, as it would be much easier to dissolve a corrupt body through legislation. Furthermore, there is not a single logical reason that a constitutional change will be more effective than a new legislation or a treaty in allowing Indigenous peoples to have their issues argued by other Indigenous peoples. The other team has also claimed that it would recognise the connection, and as we have continuously reiterated in our team case, we acknowledge the importance of identifying this connection of Indigenous peoples to the land, though we question why this has to be a constitutional change. The other team also questioned what would be in a treaty, and just as the affirmative team has suggested, reconciliation, of course, would be of paramount importance. And as our first and second speakers both recognised New Zealand as a trailblazer when it comes to the treaty, these sorts of treaties are not unheard of. The topic of the debate being that we should change the Australian Constitution to enable a voice to Parliament demands this constitutional change. So yes, this treaty may include a voice to Parliament. But we beg the question, why does this voice have to be enshrined in the Constitution when, as we have continuously stated, no other commission is? The third speaker of the opposition also claimed that it must be constitution, however, as it is the topic of the debate. However, we beg the question, why? Why must it be constitutional? In a democratic country where we have the option to place our laws to be argued by elected individuals that are representative politicians, they represent our views, or free to be interpreted in any vague way, as our second speaker mentioned, the question in itself is very vague, free to be interpreted by these judges that we don't elect. Wouldn't it be logical to choose the former? And the opposition also claimed that it's good that it would be interpreted by these professional judges. However, how many of these judges are actually Indigenous? How many of them take these views from the side of Indigenous people? It's very vague, and it will give them more freedom to interpret it in ways that we may not want to as we represent ourselves. The opposition also said that they need a voice in the Constitution for a treaty. However, this is simply not true, as we have referenced New Zealand and Canada as trailblazers for this. They do not have this voice enshrined in their Constitution, and therefore it simply makes no sense to claim such. The third speaker has also stated that we have asserted that the voice of Parliament would not mean reconciliation. However, we dispute this. We have simply stated that there are other more meaningful ways of creating this reconciliation, which, as we have claimed, would be through legislation or a treaty, which are much easier to change according to the advancements of society. The opposition also claims that it is good that it is permanent and it's harder to change the Constitution, and therefore the voice should be enshrined in the Constitution. However, as our first speaker has stated, the constitutional change would be even riskier, referencing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission from 1990 to 2005, which was very corrupt. Now imagine if this were enshrined in the Constitution, how difficult it would have been to dissolve this. The third affirmative speaker has also stated that a constitutional process would be rushing the process. However, not only is the current process suggested by the Prime Minister to be rushed, we, the negative team, support consistent debate. By legislating the voice to Parliament, we can assure current debate on the issues that currently affect Indigenous Australians. The third affirmative speaker also stated that if a High Court judge interprets a constituted voice to Parliament, that is a good thing. However, we asked the affirmative team how many High Court judges are Indigenous, as I stated previously, and how many can relate to these Indigenous issues. If it is through the representative body, we have this option where they represent our own communities. They are speaking our voice in the Parliament. As for the judges, they don't risk their positions going against our views in the current society. Our first speaker began by highlighting the difficulty in amending the Constitution and its extensive history of unsuccessful attempts, outlining the corrupt past of a commission that was assigned to represent the Indigenous voice, which was fortunately easily scrapped due to its enabler being legislation rather than the Constitution. She then went on to emphasise how all the goals of the suggested constitutional change can still be achieved through legislative means. Our second speaker proceeded to discuss the ambiguity and confusion surrounding the meaning of an Indigenous voice to Parliament and how it is paramount that we first recognise Indigenous Australians before enshrining such a vague definition of a voice in the Australian Constitution. Finally, she reiterated how notable Indigenous Australians have actually stated that constitutional change is pointless when we haven't even signed a treaty to acknowledge that sovereignty was never actually ceded. Without a clear idea of what this change to the Constitution entails, how can we be willing to sacrifice the money and the time that it takes to hold a referendum? Furthermore, is it really worth the cost to change the Constitution when the very aim of this change can simply be achieved through legislation or treaty? Thank you.